Last time we were focusing on Chapter 5 and part of Chapter 6 in our discussion of the causes of the revolution and, of course, the beginning of the nation in looking at the revolution. So I want to pick up with Chapter 6 here in looking at the Declaration of Independence itself. And as we do this, we're looking at a primary source. A primary source is a source that is an actual original source. A document like the Declaration of Independence is a primary source. A letter is a primary source. We'll look at a letter that Abigail Adams wrote her husband John Adams while he was at the Constitutional Convention. And that's a primary source. A primary source could be a diary, for example, that someone wrote, like James Madison, while he was at the Constitutional Convention. It could be a log or a blog today. Primary sources can take a variety of forms. A secondary source, meaning a source that is usually written from a number of other primary sources and other secondary sources, is your textbook. So the easiest example of a secondary source is your textbook. So the best example of what is really going on at any particular time in history is a primary source. And that's why it's so important to distinguish when we're studying any time in history or any time in the present, is to look at what people were actually thinking and writing in primary sources. So that's what we'll do as we begin today, looking at the actual primary source of the Declaration of Independence. So I put a link to that right here, and of course it's easily available to Google or easily available anywhere in any textbook like yours. And of course I've linked it to the Library of Congress here. And I ask you at the end of our last lesson to go to this link or again to your textbook or Google and just read the Declaration. It's very, very short, and I'll just pull it up as my system loads and pull it up so you can see what the original broadside or poster printed on July the 4th, 1776, what we think of as Independence Day, looked like. And I'll expand it here for you so you can see what it looked like. And you can, right at the top, you see it declares July the 4th, the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. And then if we were to read it, you can see it's pretty easy to read. This is one of two original printings, one of them being George Washington's own copy that he read to the troops. Remember, the fighting has already started by the time independence is declared. And the only thing that might be a little hard for you to read is the fact that at the time, what we would read as an S and what they read as an S looks like an F to us. So, of course, we're all familiar with the opening of the Declaration of Independence, when in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for people to dissolve the political bands. So you see how it's read. But the most famous and most revolutionary and significant part of the Declaration, of course, comes in the second paragraph. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, this is straight out of course, John Locke's theories on government and natural rights that he expressed as one of the great Enlightenment philosophers in Britain. So, as a well-read, well-educated person, Thomas Jefferson was very familiar with Locke. He knew every other well-read, well-educated person there at the convention, and throughout the colonies would know Locke, and throughout the world would know Locke and would accept this Lockean philosophy. Then he continues more about government theory, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its power in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So here he gives the rationale for the revolution. And then he goes on to explain in more detail why the Americans have decided to break up with Great Britain. And then, of course, he continues throughout the document to give a specific list of charges. That's what most of the document is, against King George and the British government. And then at the end, he very dramatically, pardon me, let me zoom in here. At the end, he very dramatically ends with this last sentence. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor, because they are, remember, committing high treason. And so they are, in signing this document, literally pledging their lives. Captured, they can be they can be, of course, hanged or executed. Their fortunes, their property can be confiscated, and their honor, if they do not win, will be forever besmirched. They will go down in history as traitors. So this is literally true. They are pledging all of these things, signing this document. Now this is John Hancock, who was presiding at the Second Continental Congress, signs first, and he signs large. Now this is a printing, but when you look at the original signature, you can still read his name, because he said he wanted King George to be able to read his name without his spectacles, without his glasses. So that is not just a self-aggrandizing action by John Hancock, but a truly brave action. I would have thought, like these other guys, really small at the bottom, but that's what they do. So you see the signers here, and of course there's John Hancock's signature affixed to the copy. So this is a primary source, an original document that tells us a lot about the thinking of those at the Second Continental Congress who edited and approved Jefferson's great work. So let's think about this a little bit. Let me go back to our screen in the slides, and I've asked you a series of questions to think about. I was hoping to be with you, but I'm still quarantined, and so let's go through these just a little bit for a little thought. The first thing I asked you to think about was, according to Jefferson, what's the purpose of government? Remember what he says. He says that government is to protect basically what Locke would have called our natural rights: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's why governments are instituted among men. So we think of those natural rights, whenever we think of the purpose of government. And the second question I ask you to think about is, what should happen whenever government, as Jefferson said, becomes destructive of those ends for which it was created? That's the whole rationale, as Jefferson states it, for the revolution. So if government fails that contract, doesn't protect those basic rights, then it's the right of the people, as Jefferson said, to alter or abolish that government. So that's the whole justification for the revolution. Now, of course, the revolutionary document, this declaration, seems to our ears today to be a little hypocritical, because remember, the famous phrase that Jefferson uses is, all men are created equal, in number 2, in point 2 here. So let's think about what he meant by that statement. we know that that is our highest aspiration. That is our great ideal in American history, that all of us are created equal, that we don't have a royal family in the United States. We don't believe in kings or queens or dictators, that we believe in a meritocracy. That is, we believe that those who are the best should rise, that if you merit through your skill or your hard work, study, that you should be able to succeed. So that's generally how we've interpreted that statement. But we know that that's not literally true when Jefferson writes those words. Jefferson himself, remember, was in fact a slaveholder. In fact, he was having an affair with a young woman he owned, and he would have a number of children together with that young woman named Sally Hemings, and he would free her children, their children. So we know that he didn't literally mean, and none of those men, well, very few of those men who would sign off on the Declaration meant all men were created equal. Most of them endorsed and supported slavery. We know that that wasn't a literal statement, but we know that through our history, we've come to fight to make that statement more true. We know we live in a time when Black Lives Matter movement is a very hot button issue and one that we all have strong feelings about. So we know that statement is not literally true today as we sit here studying this document in 2020, a time Jefferson and the signers of this document could not imagine. So think about how we might write that statement today. How would we rewrite that statement? What do we mean by this ideal that all men are created equal? There was debate about it even then. There was debate about ending slavery. And in point 3, there was debate about including women in it behind the scenes. In March, long before the July signing of the Declaration, printing of the Declaration on the 4th, Abigail Adams, wife of John Adams, who's a very influential member, future president, signer of the Declaration, member of the Continental Congress, I should say, she wrote to him a very famous letter, another primary source, in which she encouraged him to remember the ladies. It's known as the Remember the Ladies letter. And she didn't mean this in a tongue-in-cheek way. She literally meant to remember the ladies in this revolution. And so I've included here in the link her letter. There are many, many letters, very famous, back and forth between the two, between the couple, that give you a lot of insight into daily life. So how do we know what everyday life was like? Well, we know it mostly from the letters that people exchanged and the diaries that people kept then. And so this is the March 31, 1776 letter. And you can read the whole thing. It's very famous. But what's famous about it, what makes it the Remember the Ladies letter, is I'll scroll down to it for our purposes. And you can see it's toward the end, the last couple of paragraphs here before the April the 5th letter begins. And I'll just cut to the chase here. She says, beginning here after this little dash, she says, I long to hear that you have declared an independency. She's for independence. And by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would, and here's the famous phrase, remember the ladies, and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation. Then she goes on to say that your sex are naturally tyrannical is a truth so thoroughly established as to admit of no dispute, but such of you as wish to be happy willingly give up the harsh title of master for the more tender and endearing one of friend. And she goes on to make her argument to remember the ladies. She's asking for rights for women in 1776, and she's foreshadowing the women's movement that will not win the vote for women until, of course, we know 100 years ago, 1920, for white women, and not for black women and other women of color until the 1960s. So very recent history. And the right to vote, of course, being contested right now, 2020, as we look at this famous document. They did not include, of course, that all men and women are created equal, but we assume the word meant to be all-inclusive, kind of royal we, and to include women as human beings there. So this is a little insight into more of what the founders were thinking, or at least were considering. So today, when we look at this document, what we interpret it to mean in 2020 might be quite different than what those who signed that document were thinking or meant by it in 1776. And that is what makes this Republic of the United States so resilient and able to survive through so many transitions in our history. Are those great glorious words of Jefferson true today? Of course not totally true. But those ideals that he expresses are revolutionary and express the highest ideals that most of us would agree we aspire to as a nation. They have inspired many rebellions and revolutions since. So they remain among the most historic and most revolutionary words, not just in American history, but in world history. So think about those. Read the Declaration if you haven't, and think about those words, and think about what they meant, what Jefferson meant, what we would mean, how we would rewrite those words today. And Abigail Adams, way back in 1776, how she encouraged her husband and the convention leaders, the congressional leaders, I should say, to remember the ladies. It's been a long journey to get to where we are, and we have a long journey ahead. Now, remember the war is ongoing, and in order to be successful, to win this independence once it's been declared, George Washington, who's been appointed, of course, as commander of American forces, has to keep recruiting, has to keep the forces he has, which is very, very difficult. So I've asked you to think about, would you have been a patriot? It would have put you in the minority. But this is an interesting short clip to consider. Would you have joined up with Washington? Uncle Sam certainly wants you to. So I'd ask you to watch this if you haven't, but for time's sake, I won't play it here. Now let's think about the key battles very quickly, just to point them out. There are many battles. For our purposes, we won't go through the whole war, but the first really key turning point battle after the war began is the Battle of Saratoga. It took place in 1777, and it is the first time that Washington's forces really have a great victory. And even though it is a great victory, the reason it's so important, I know your text really stresses the fact that it's a morale booster, and it is, but in the whole scheme of the war, it converts this war really to a world war again. And remember, the British have such overwhelming strength when opposing the small and really ragtag American forces, the only real hope we have in winning is to get foreign help. And remember, still the great enemy of the British are the French. And so this leads to the French alliance that really helps us win. So the French come in because they see now that we have a chance, that we are a reasonably good fighting force. And the French would love to get back at the British for the great defeat they suffered in the French and Indian War. So we get an official alliance with the French, and this means money, this means men, this means especially a navy, an important navy necessary for victory. So the war begins to turn around after the French alliance, after Saratoga. And again, you have maps in your text like this that will show you that the war in the north, this is Saratoga here in New York, after Saratoga begins to improve. And the British, hoping to get more allies fighting, more Tories or loyalists in America fighting with them, will begin to move from the northern battles to the south, because it is true that more Tories or loyalists live in the south. About 20% of American colonists side with the British. So they move south. Pardon me. And this is where the largest battle, the last great battle in the war, takes place at Yorktown in Virginia on the coast. And this is where in 1781 the British General Cornwallis is trapped by Washington's forces on land, and the French fleet comes in and traps him by sea. He's forced to surrender 7,000 British troops. This is a humiliating defeat, and it breaks the will of the British to continue the war. You can see again Yorktown. After this, the British negotiated peace. The French alliance, again, was key to this victory, as was Washington's leadership, the dual army tradition, that we still have today with the Guard and the active duty service. And of course, the British had always watched their back overseas, so they always had international concerns. They could never put all their forces on the American war. This is a famous painting I put in your slides to show you that the British, remember, never showed up to have their painting because they were so embarrassed by losing the war to the Americans. And you see the original United States here, of course, in this map after the Treaty of Paris concludes the war for independence in 1783. So this is the original United States. Now that we've won the war, the great test is, of course, to govern, to complete independence. I will turn to that next.